bad because everybody was poor. So no, you didn't feel like you were poor. You were like everybody else.
Right. You didn't live the richest life, but relatively, you weren't poor.
No. The the two things that I remember myself without stories. I remember the first house that I remember living in. It was just almost like 2.5 rooms, and there were my mother and dad, of course, and me, and my brother was all then. My sister wasn't born yet. And of course, Sam wasn't born yet. And it was like we all almost slept in the same bed. We didn't have beds and I can remember the people across the street from us, they had like 5 children. And of course, they didn't have anything either. And he was a good friend. My dad and he, the man across the street, became good friends. And we kept those friends practically all of our lives. But they didn't have anything either. And so it got down to where if we had food and they didn't have any food, then they came over and ate with us. And when they had food and we didn't have any, we'd go over and eat with them. One time my dad, I can remember this. One time my dad, back then there were what they called dry goods store. And this lady had one just in her front room. And they sold things, she sold things like needles and thread, and because women did so much sewing then, and all kind of women's sewing supplies. That's how she kept herself going. But she also had slot machines in her store. And I can remember my dad having 1 dime left in his pocket, put it in the slot machine, and hit the slot machine, and just came home with bags of groceries. We were also, here he came with all these groceries, and where did you get them? He hit the jackpot of the slot machine. Otherwise, and they used to go, what they had, well, they still have them, but of course not as many people use them now. The railroad salvage yards, it was like when a case of, say, carrots, green beans, whatever, was dented and they thought they couldn't use it anymore. They put it to the railroad salvage yard. And people used to go down there because they'd give it away. And this man across the road, I can remember Dad doing this. In the wintertime, they would go out along the railroad tracks and pick coal that had fallen off the train. So we'd have enough coal to heat the house, because all we had were coal stoves. We didn't have anything electric. We had electric lights, but you didn't have anything else, Okay?
Yeah.
You didn't have, like, in your house now, how many things are run by electric?
Like at least half the stuff there. So
Right.
all those light bulbs, computer, are like free TVs,
Yeah.
consoles, a lot of stuff.
Yeah. And what would you do if you didn't have any electric at all? Burn candles.
Yeah. So you could have some form of light.
We did that. We did candles. And let's see. There's another story I was going to tell. But it was, this depression was bad. And the reason this depression was so bad was because so many people lost their homes, foreclosed and everything. way back then, people lost everything, and if you saw on television, you do this last depression, you didn't see lines of people waiting to get food or for soup kitchens. There were soup kitchens put up everywhere that you could go. Men who were out of work could go and get a bowl of soup and a piece of bread, and that was their meal for the day. And I don't think I saw a potato chip in my house until I was 16 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. And Mom always managed some fruit. And the other thing that it did, it split families up, because during the Depression, my dad and I, things were so bad, my dad and I went to live with his mother and dad, and Mom and Sonny went down to the farm where her people were, down in Pinckneyville, Illinois. And so that's the way they lived. The little house that my dad and I went to is still over on Sullivan Drive. It's right there on one of the corners of Sullivan Drive, and of course it's fixed up now, but it was just a little house, and Grandma and Grandpa lived there, and that was all. And we went over there, and we stayed with them during the Depression, because we couldn't afford food for the whole family. So that's how we did it. And all families did that. And these lines and these people who have lost everything now, their homes, there were homes that were hundreds of thousands of dollars, and these people lost them. And they lost their cars and everything. We're talking about people who lived in shacks, like you saw online. On the sidewalks, they would be 3 and 4 deep, these men. And the lines were forever. There was no money, there was nothing. And then that's where the food kitchens came in. It's not like going to a food kitchen now. People who are having to do that now, there are people still doing that. They get food here. Every other week they get a box of food here. You have to be very low income to get it. But they never got anything like that way back when. So then, and that was all during Hoover. And then, of course, they called them Hoover Towns. And then Franklin Roosevelt came into power. And we were still pretty much in a depression until we really got into the war in Europe, the First World War. Tell me what you were going to say.
Was it because the military needed a lot of jobs for that?
There were no jobs. See, there weren't manufacturing plants like there are, like they became after Roosevelt became president. Then, and I don't remember why, but things were still bad. But you know how Trump talks, he's going to make jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Roosevelt did that, slowly but surely. But the big jobs didn't come until the war, because then we needed steel, and then we needed airplanes, and then we needed I don't know if I'm right about this or not, the first assembly line was Ford Company. Car company. That was the first assembly line. But even then, there were no jobs, there was no money. It was, and I don't know how does a country get in that kind of, well, of course his his policies, I guess. You know, he favored no taxes and that sort of thing. You can't run a country without taxes. You know, that's your income. And it was, I can remember, and Bill, your great-grandfather, his mother told me the same thing. I had 2 dresses when I started school. And I'd wear one day, and I'd come home at night, and Mother would wash it, and the next day I'd wear the other clean one, and I'd come home at night, and she'd wash that. We never went dirty, as poor as we were. We never went dirty. And I had 1 pair of shoes, and I wasn't at the point where I had to go barefooted without any shoes. But only, and you know what I remember? The schools were so cold because there wasn't much money. I had to wear these socks to school, and they were these ugly brown. Oh, I hated them. They were so ugly, and I had to wear those to stay warm. And that's terrible. That's just ego, you know, but oh, I hated it. But, and Bill's mother, he had 2 pair of pants, and she did the same thing. He'd wear one day, and then the next day she'd put a clean pair on him and wash the dirty ones. You didn't have anything. I never, heavens, I don't think I went to the show till I was in junior high or high school. And it's just a regular show. And it took a long time. I don't know to this day. We got lucky somehow. And I don't know to this day, and everybody's dead that I want to talk to, how Dad got on the police force. And how he ever got on the police force and got a job, I don't know. But now this is right after the Depression. In that neighborhood where we lived on 60th Street, 61st Street, 62nd Street, 63rd Street, 64th Street, 65th Street. Because back then, and this was right after the Depression, and because of the Depression, whoever owned a piece of property never asked for a lease. Oh, you know, you could move in without a lease or anything else. And did you drop your...
Yep.
Yeah. And so Dad, every time he got a little bit better job, he'd move us to a little bit nicer house. And then when he got a little bit better one, we'd move to another house. My mother would just pack up and move at the drop of a hat. Didn't bother her at all. On the police force, the only jobs that were just pick-me-up jobs somewhere, you know, just somebody needed something done, and do that kind of thing. But the first Christmas, not the first Christmas, well, the first one I remember, this house was a 2-story house, but in the floor was a register built, about that big, for the heat to come upstairs. And so, of course, we kids were all looking down the road. Mom and Dad were putting things out downstairs for Christmas, and we were all looking down the register so we could see everything. And as soon as he got everything out, it was like this every Christmas. So he wanted us down there right then. He was so proud that Christmas he could buy us presents. So it was a long time. There are people hurting now, but they're hurting in a different way than back then. It was just, I looked up, you've looked online. Have you seen the big long lines? I looked up the other day for Faye, who works for me. Now Faye's 52 years old. She's never heard of the Great Depression. She couldn't believe anything. So I looked it up. And the pictures were bad. And there were a lot of race riots during that time. And the big race riot was in 1917 in East St. Louis. East St. Louis had one of the worst race riots the country has seen. You couldn't walk down, if you were downtown, you never got to go downtown, and you were on a sidewalk, and a black was coming towards you, they stepped off the sidewalk for you. A white wouldn't walk on the same sidewalk with the black. They were expected to get out of your way. And that was all down in South St. Louis, or East St. Louis, and that's where they lived. And they stayed there. And the other place was what they called Goose Hill, which was, and see, that was something else. After the Civil War, there was this great migration from the South up north, all of the freed slaves, because they thought they could get jobs. Well, that just pushed the population in the northern cities up, and more people weren't eating and didn't have homes and were in Hooverville. And East St. Louis, after the Civil War and after the Depression started slowing down, it was always said, if you can't get a job in East St. Louis, then you can't get a job anywhere. Because East St. Louis had first of all, East St. Louis had the stockyards, and those were all Polish people that had come over. And we had a great migration of, immigrants that came in. Even during all of that time, that terrible time, immigrants were not stopped from coming here. We had the Irish, we had the Polish, we had the Italians, and they all came here thinking America was so great and they could get jobs. And the slaves, do you know the Irish people were used really as slaves? The only way they could come over here is if they knew they had a job. But when they got here and the job was here, and they knew that when they came, they would be indentured to these people that they were working for, like for 6 years or 7 years. They had to stay with those people to pay for their passage over here. So the Irish had some slavery too. But all of that contributed to the Depression. I don't know, and I'd have to look. I didn't look at that. They wouldn't look at it very long, because there were riots and there were black people killed, and she wouldn't look at it very long, so I didn't look at it very long either. But I'd wonder how our population grew during that time. And these people were in shabby clothes. They had no clothes. They didn't have anything. They didn't have anything. That's a song for you to look up. Brother, can you spare a dime?
I just think I heard of that.
You had
I might have seen it in my local studies hole.
Yeah. It was Brother, can you spare a dime? And a dime back then bought lots of stuff if you had a dime in your pocket.
Because money inflates over time, doesn't it?
What, honey?
Because money inflated a lot over that time, didn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. You had no money. And banks failed. Banks failed. And they weren't big banks like these. Banks used to be neighborhood banks. My family was never in a bank during the Depression. I couldn't tell you what year it was that my dad maybe got a checking account. No check. Couldn't do anything. Nobody would take a check. You know, if they just wouldn't take a check. They wanted money. I was born and raised a Democrat. I'll always be a Democrat. But never before, even, when a Republican got elected, okay, you didn't like it because they beat you and Democrats didn't make it. But there wasn't the evil that there is. See, this man scares me. He scares me. Because I wonder what he's going to do for my children and my grandchildren. What's going to happen to them. But, Franklin Roosevelt, and I'm sure you saw that in your social studies book. What did he say?
He said he'd give everyone, I don't remember if it was square or fair, but I think it was one of those two.
Square deal.
Yeah.
And his big thing was you had nothing to fear but fear itself.
Yeah, I heard that.
Uh-huh.
I think that those are definitely words to live by.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm afraid of this man because of what he'll do, but people will say it's the worst thing that ever happened to our country. Well, it's not the worst thing that ever happened to our country. We've made it through the revolution. Americans are really pretty revolutionary people when you come right down to it. And, of course, the revolution, but we made it through the Civil War and almost tore the country up. And there was a Great Depression there at that time. And then we made it through the First World War and the Second World War. We go through those things, but we always seem to come out all right. It was, and that's why when Roosevelt came in then, and everything started to turn around, and, they will say, history will say, that it would not have turned around if we had not gone in the war to help the English, because that's when we needed all the manufacturing, and then that put people to work. And men went in the army, and they had a place to eat and sleep and live. But no one, I'm not going to say no one, but I don't remember people being put in jail because they were homeless or because they were sleeping on the streets or anything like that. They didn't do that because everybody was doing that. All men. Men left their families because they couldn't support them. It was, I feel sorry for people who have lost their homes now, but I think you've lost a $200,000 or $300,000 home, maybe. And maybe you shouldn't have spent that much money for your home. And maybe you shouldn't have 2 or 3 cars and all of that stuff. Back then, people had nothing to begin with and lost what they did have, which was nothing. And I can remember, and I don't remember if this was before the Civil War. I mean the Depression, or it would have come right close to it. John L. Lewis and the coal miners. That's when the coal miners, and were one of the first occupations to do it, wanted to start a union. And I can remember when Dad and I lived in this little house, during the Depression with Grandma and Grandpa. It was on Sullivan Drive. And Sullivan Drive wasn't paved then or anything. It was just like a mud road. And across the street, you could see out the window, right across the street, there was a light pole. And one night, the coal miners in the area got together and they hung John Lewis in effigy, And I looked out and there was that dummy hanging there. But they were the ones who were against the unions. And so they hung him. But the coal miners finally ended up getting there. But that was either right. Well, I don't know. It had to be during the Depression, because I was at my grandma's house. I remember seeing it from her window. And that's when I was living with her. We didn't have to do that very long. Mom and Sonny went to the country, and her sister lived on a farm. They had a farm. So they had food down there. So then Dad was up here. Dad and I were with Grandma and Grandpa. Grandpa worked in the coal mines. My grandpa worked in the coal mines. And so he had a job. But he was lucky. But see, I wasn't old enough to know how bad it was. It was just what we did. And you didn't hear that many complaints. You didn't hear about, taking over Washington. You didn't hear all of the stuff you hear now. If there were demonstrations, and I'm sure there were, I don't remember them. What's it say about it in your studies? Do you have a young teacher or an old teacher?
She's young, yeah.
She doesn't know anything about the Depression either, does she? You gotta get an old lady or an old man. We have a lady who lives here who is 97 years old. And she still gets up every day. She's downstairs. I don't know how she sees. She's working a jigsaw puzzle every day.